Yeah. Dear Dr. Hughes, can you introduce yourself to our viewers? And of course, we're going to talk about your research in Jordan. You spent maybe more than 15 years in the Middle East, and you're fluent in Arabic. So please let us know more about your studies in Jordan and studies in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I'm Geoffrey Hughes. I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter in Britain. I'm American, obviously, by nationality. I first came to Jordan in 2006, so about 15 years ago now. And I've lived there probably all told between 4 and 5 years. My first stint in Jordan was as a Peace Corps volunteer from about 2006 to 2008. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a sort of a artifact of sort of mid-20th century American optimism, this idea that you could send someone with a bachelor's degree to some sort of relatively marginalized village in some other part of the world, and through sheer can-do attitude, they could transform that community. So of course, I don't know how much good I actually did during my initial 2 years in Jordan, but I did learn a lot about the country. I really fell in love with the culture, and I decided that I wanted to learn more about it. I think if you told me that I would go and sort of become an expert on kinship and marriage when I first went to Jordan, I would have thought that you were crazy. These weren't necessarily topics that I was interested in, but it was actually by living in the community, by listening to what people themselves were interested in, and by deciding that my research interests needed to be guided by the interests of the people that I was talking to, that I came to these topics. I would have to say in some ways I was actually dragged kicking and screaming, because in a lot of ways, I initially found these topics to be quite boring, quite pedestrian. But I would be in the village, and it seemed like all conversations were either about building houses or marriage, and all conversations about houses led to talk of marriage, and all talk of marriage led to talk of housing and the country's sort of severe housing shortage. When I got back to the US, I studied for a PhD in anthropology, which is the study of humanity, of course. And based on that research, I've now published my first book, which is called Affection and Mercy, Kinship, Islam, and the Politics of Marriage in Jordan. And in this book, I attempt to understand how marriage is being transformed in Jordan, and in turn, how traditional social structures, especially concerning with tribes or clans, are increasingly being challenged by new forms of social organization, be these sort of neoliberal property standardization initiatives, whether these be Islamic charities and Islamist political organizing, or whether this be more liberal democratic rights-based activism. More subsequently, I've continued, of course, to work on issues around gender, kinship, and sexuality, but I've also moved into other terrain as well. So I've continued to work on issues around clans and tribes in Jordan, with a focus on blood feuds and conflict resolution. And I've also become very interested in the phenomenon of envy. So I think all of these are multifarious, multifaceted sort of topics, but I also would argue they all weave together in some ways. And as an anthropologist, and specifically as an ethnographer, I tend to ground my scholarship in the communities where I work and live, and in the lived experiences of the people I work with. So I try to let that drive my research. And so if I sometimes seem like my research has these sort of different thrusts, different sort of tangents, I do find that they all have a sort of a locus in that sort of face-to-face community where I conduct my research.
So how you merge with the local community? Because for a couple of years, you worked in Man, which is a flashpoint for all kinds of uprisings, rebellions, and internal conflicts. How they accepted you? Because to live and work in Man, it's not easy for other Arabs who are not Manis. How they embraced you? Have you had a good interaction with Manis, or there were some clashes or
Yeah, so I mean, I think I've had really excellent experiences overall in Jordan. I think it's in some ways it's a great place to work as a foreign researcher, But of course, I'm also not naive about a lot of the tensions that exist here, right? So obviously, as an American, you would obviously expect that there would be a certain amount of resentment around sort of U.S. foreign policy, both its impact on the Palestinian question, given how many Jordanians are Palestinian, and then of course also given the situation in Iraq, the number of Iraqi refugees, and the sort of the long-term and very deep sort of cultural and social connections between Jordan and these other countries, which have in many ways been victims of U.S. foreign policy. However, of course, I think a lot of people, I mean, just in general, but I think especially in Jordan, people are very sort of good about differentiating between government policies and individuals, and they tend to see the individual, and especially if you make an effort to respect the local customs and traditions and learn the language, they see that as sort of a form of respect, and they try to reciprocate that, right? So respect is a two-way street generally, and that I think works very well. Now, I think one thing that I will also point out, of course, is that in some ways, I think I have an especially privileged position as an American researcher who is so distant from the local culture, right? So there's a sort of a long-running ethos and a discourse around hospitality, I think, in Arab and Jordanian culture, which we're all somewhat familiar with. As the saying goes, the guest is the prisoner of the host, in the sense that, but then this sort of reverses, right? And the second half of the aphorism goes that the guest becomes a poet when they travel. And this is why the host must fear the guest, right? So there's this kind of two-way street where to be subject to hospitality is, of course, this act of trust. You're giving yourself over to the other person. You're putting yourself at their mercy. But it's also the other way around, right? That by bringing you in, by sort of extending you hospitality, they're also giving you the power over them to later on potentially saying negative and embarrassing things about them. So there's always, I think, a very subtle and delicate dance, just in any sort of sort of mode of hospitality in general. And we can, I think, see this as a deeply human problem, right? And one that perhaps Arabs and Bedouins have very poetically captured in a lot of ways. But then I think that this is accentuated also in the ethnographic encounter, where I, as a representative of a more powerful, dominant imperial culture, come and stay with people from a more subordinate and marginalized culture, with the full knowledge that I will then represent them to the world, and that I will have, in a lot of ways, more power in the larger scheme of things to define the relationship ultimately than they do in the short to medium term. So I think in that way, I would say that my personal sort of experience of living in Ma'an might not be the experience of, say, someone who was just a tourist, right, who might just sort of completely not understand any of these subtleties, and might just sort of not understand all of the expectations and all of the ethics, really, of that relationship. Or on the other hand, of a very sort of close at hand sort of academic or scholar, for instance, from Amman or from Beirut or from some other nearby Arab community, who would, of course, have a very different relationship with Ma'an in terms of larger geostrategic and geopolitical sort of dynamics.
In general, people in Ma'an and around the world are like a mirror. If we reflect good, they're going to also appreciate that good, and it will be a successful and proactive exchange of positive experiences and positive ideas. How did you learn Arabic? You probably started learning Arabic before you came to Ma'an and before you came to Jordan, because this is also very, very important, and it made your life easier, and in a way, it broke barriers that would normally exist between a foreigner who doesn't speak Arabic and the local community, because in Ma'an, not many people are English speakers, or lots of them that you would interact are not that fluent in English. So actually, Arabic was an asset for you.
Yeah. I mean, so I started studying Arabic in Morocco, actually, which I mean, in a lot of ways, I ended up learning, I think, more French doing that and improving my French more than I improved my Arabic. But it gave me, of course, a very good foundation. And then I was able to begin taking modern standard Arabic at Portland State University with the late, great Dirham Svet, who was an excellent professor who I think did us all a real favor by emphasizing a lot of the sort of the grammar, the judur, things like that, over sort of a more conversational approach. So I kind of had this interpretive grid in my brain when I sort of arrived in Jordan. And because I understood the sort of the syntax and morphology of the language, even though I hadn't necessarily been exposed to the Jordanian dialect, I found that I was able to sort of learn it a lot faster than a lot of my American colleagues who didn't have that background or even had other backgrounds with a little bit of Arabic, right? Where especially because I had a strong grounding in the grammar, that it actually really helped me when I was put into this sort of immersive sink or swim kind of experience where they just sort of drop you in a village and see if you can survive.
True. I mean, in 2017, we spoke about your project, Nation and Nation, Kingship, Conflict, and Social Control in Contemporary Jordan. Can you say more about that project?
Yeah, so this is kind of following up on my dissertation fieldwork, right? So this all began when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork. Basically, this was a project that I sort of devised before the Arab Spring, and then I arrived in Jordan and the Arab Spring happened, right? And so I was, on the one hand, I was doing my normal research every day. I would go to the Sharia courts, or I would go to the Housing Urban Development Corporation archives, or I would, sort of go, sort of hang out on construction sites and sort of hang out at weddings and things. But meanwhile, of course, there was a lot of political turmoil happening in the background of all of this. It was not uncommon for me to come across these so-called tribal clashes that would break out. And the general sort of rubric for this would be something like this, right? There would be some sort of point of honor between two families in the area. And then the young men would basically organize on social media to basically fight it out at some particular appointed time. The two sides would come together, usually with the one side trying to attack the businesses and homes of the other side, and the other side trying to defend them. The Darak, or the gendarmerie riot police, would then sort of come in and try and separate out the two, at which point they would all begin attacking the Darak. And then there would begin this sort of process of trying to resolve the conflict. And this is where the older generation would sort of come in and try and exert control. Now, of course, this also led to a very interesting sort of question for me, right? Which was, on the one hand, we have, sort of what seems to be a new technology, right? The social media. But the new technology, and I guess this isn't necessarily surprising. In some ways, this is exactly what you would expect to happen. But the new technology doesn't necessarily lead to new social relationships, but rather it leads people to elaborate existing social relationships and existing social tensions along slightly new lines. And so I think one of the main things that emerged for me as an observer was seeing how the tribal structure was basically sort of running up against a sort of a new sort of power equation, right? Or at least in the very short run, you had an older generation, which would oftentimes give me these sort of jeremiads about the decline of tribalism, right? So on the one hand, I would be hearing, oh, the tribes are no more, there's no tribalism anymore. And on the other hand, I would be looking on my smartphone as young people were organizing tribal clashes on their smartphones, which were being duly reported in the Jordanian media on sites like Amal News and Khaberni and things like this, which of course led to this sort of interesting question, right? From the older generation's perspective, you couldn't have tribes without sheikhs. And when they would try to describe what tribalism was all about, they would describe them very much in terms of the sheikhs. Whereas when I talked to the younger people, it was very clear that in a lot of ways, what they found so exciting about the social media, and also, of course, about these tribal clashes, but it was a way for a younger generation of men to basically make an end run around this sort of older gerontocratic power structure and assert their own agency in the face of these existing power structures. So this led me to write an article based on some of this, how basically social media might reconfigure tribal affiliation along new lines, right? So to give a sort of very concrete example of what this might look like, there's a traditional notion in Bedouin communities of what's called Khamsat ad-Dam, right? Which is in the case of a point of honor, a sort of a tribal clash, that if there's, say, like a sort of a homicide in particular or something of that nature, very serious, that culpability isn't an individual thing, right? It's shared going back a number of generations. And this is often represented with a sort of an imaginary dagger held in the hand. And the idea is that you have the different generations that will face banishment, right? At least 3 generations, right? But then you get to sort of the 4th and the 5th generation, and there's this option to pay what's called the sort of the sleeping camel or the ba'anayim, right? Which will then allow you to sort of stay and look over the property of your banished relatives, right?
Yeah.
So this is, of course, a way of very carefully sort of accounting for genealogy and using it to enforce a larger system of accountability along tribal lines, right? But of course, what we were seeing in the time period when I'm talking about 2011, 2012, you would get these conflicts like between the Mani and the Hoitat, where there was a shooting at, I believe it was Hussein bin Talal University in Man.
Yeah, it happened in Man. Just to explain that to viewers. These tribes are located near Man, and in Man, it's in southern Jordan.
Yeah, so there's these 2 tribes in southern Jordan. One is called the Hoitat, the other is called the Mani. Basically, the Hoitat, or at least I shouldn't say the whole tribe, of course, but some youth who associated themselves with the Hoitat, which is itself, of course, a gigantic federation of, sort of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, began pulling people off of buses throughout southern Jordan, checking their IDs, and attacking people who had a last name that showed that they were part of the Mani tribal confederation. Right. So from the perspective of the older generation, this was horrifying. This was a complete, sort of breach of the traditional tribal order, which should, of course, be very sort of rigorously emphasizing this Khamsat ad-Dam. But in the face of social media and the sort of, I think, the kind of the tribal imaginary that a social media sort of allows, all of a sudden, tribal identity meant something very different. It was much less mediated by individual sort of male kinship linkages, and it was much more about a last name, right? So this is almost like more of a shift from an idea of tribes in a sort of traditional anthropological language to an idea of clans, right? Where sort of the genealogy is a lot more amorphous, and you have these much larger groups of people whose relationship is a lot more arbitrary and conventional and a lot less genealogical. And so this potentially, at least, I mean, you could kind of imagine how over time social media could really accentuate this as a different way of thinking about what tribe or asha'ar or qaba'il would mean in a society like Jordan. That as you get people increasingly identifying their tribal sort of heritage based on Facebook groups, based on these sorts of more mass mediated, sort of internet mediated, social media mediated relationships, that will then impact the very nature of tribal conflict in the country more generally.
What do you think about tribal structure in urban areas? Did you have the opportunity to study clans and tribes and their structure in bigger centers like Zarga and Amman? Or you just focus on Man?
So I have not done extensive research on tribal structures in urban areas, but I think it's very important to note that you cannot make a really crude, sort of division between urban and rural, and as they often say, hadari and mudani, or sort of civilized, or sorry, not Bedouin and sort of hadari, right, or sort of sedentary and nomadic, or sort of ash'ari and mudani, sort of.
It's an outdated division. If we talk about that division, it's outdated completely.
So you've had a lot of urbanization, and a lot of the people who have come to the city, they bring these tribal networks with them, right? And in fact, if you look at the organization of a lot of these sort of very new urban areas that have emerged in Jordan, they actually sort of are organized along tribal lines. So I think probably the most sort of obvious example of this sort of phenomenon would be Haitafila in
in
Amman.
Jabal Taj.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
of course, not only Haitafila, you have other neighborhoods in Jabal Taj, in Ashrafia and Jofe, which are made of tribes and clans from East Bank, West Bank, and this is how they feel more comfortable to cluster around their king. So they bring their villages and their lifestyle from the countryside into Amman. Amman nowadays, with Zarga and Ruseifa, probably has around 7 million people. This is the whole population of Amman and Zarga. So they come with similar structure, similar social habits and social fabrics. So how did you find the influence of modern technology? And you mentioned that before, that Facebook and social media plays a role in modern tribalism. We don't have an old school tribalism that's operated in early 20th century or in 1940s, but we have members of different clans attacking each other, insulting each other, or pacifying each other via the social media.
Exactly. Yeah. So this led me, for instance, as one might expect, right? It's an arms race. So first, the youth they get involved with social media. The older generation is, of course, a little slow. They don't necessarily understand it, and I think obviously there's a sort of an older generation that never will. You know, they're past their prime anyway. But there is now the emergence of a new generation of what we might call Facebook sheikhs, or as some have called them, a sheikh sini, right? Or sort of the Chinese sheikh, as this idea of a sort of a counterfeit sheikh, right? So the idea here is that increasingly, if you do want to be a sort of a powerful tribal leader, that is itself going to have to be mediated through social media, right? So for instance, you know, I've worked with one sort of powerful sheikh in Amman. I wouldn't say that he's a fake sheikh. He's just sort of using the technology to support all the other sorts of power he already has, right? So I was invited to meet with him. You know, I was sort of taken to his mansion in Amman, sort of a beautiful, like white stone-faced house mansion. But then in back behind his house, he had a goat hair tent with all of the traditional trappings of, you know, sort of the coffee service. He had a sort of a line of sort of young boys come out and sort of present us with sweets to eat. I believe it was like right after Ramadan at that time, so it was sort of an Eid thing. And then we were, of course, served, you know, sort of coffee and tea by his sort of migrant servants, who he, of course, wanted to make sure that I knew were not his own daughters, but were foreign servants of his. So yet again, sort of emphasizing that he already has these sort of transnational networks and linkages with the government and all these other things. But he also, of course, uses his goat hair tent in his backyard behind his mansion in the middle of Amman to organize reconciliations, right? So this is an opportunity for him to project power, right? So for instance, in a, you know, classic case these days in Jordan, right, a car accident, right? If you get in a car accident in contemporary Jordan, you'll oftentimes supplement any sort of insurance payout with a sort of a sulha, or a sort of a reconciliation ceremony, which is intended to sort of communicate to the larger community that everything is okay, that any sort of bad feelings over the death of someone or the injury of someone has been taken care of. And he basically offers himself now to do this service for you, right? So you can go to his tent, you can bring your friends along with you, and basically they will videotape it and they'll film it and they'll put it on social media so that everybody can basically see that this reconciliation has happened. You might even bring media as well. Not only that, but also people can contribute to the blood money payment if they want as well. And this is a form of religious merit that's sort of basically recognized in the Sunnah. So he very proudly told me that people from as far away as Saudi Arabia will sometimes pay some of the blood money to sort of ease the way for these sorts of reconciliations and sort of to bring the Muslim community back together.
I mean, borders that we have in the Middle East are artificial, and lots of tribes are residing in 2 or 3 countries. The best example are tribes that live in northern Saudi Arabia, in northeastern Jordan, and southeastern Syria, and they're all keen. But this is another topic to talk about. We can talk about Sykes-Picot maybe next time, but what I wanted to say is how senior men, how senior chieftains feel threatened with Facebook, for instance, or modern technology. Because from your previous example, we learned that a sheikh who is recording all kinds of gatherings and sessions where he's reconciling warring sides is following the modern technology. On the other hand, we have old school chieftains who are against social media and against modern technology. What's the dominant trend?
Well, I think I think that the dominant trend is that people who can't use the technology will probably basically disappear off the stage, and people who can use the technology will over time reassert themselves. And what you'll see basically is, I think as we've seen more generally with technology over the course of the last 10 years, is that there's a kind of, what we don't see is the kind of the liberatory, sort of promise that was sold to us by the marketing departments of these transnational corporations that were selling us these technologies, right? But what actually happened was that initially people didn't understand how it worked for the most part. There were a few people who were very agile and able to take advantage of it. And this obviously, I think, had a profound impact on Jordanian, but also sort of Arab society more generally, global society really throughout the early 2010s. But what we've seen subsequently is that the people with the money and the guns and the connections and these sort of deeper and more entrenched forms of social and political capital obviously have a lot of advantages at their disposal. And a new technology does not in any way negate any of those advantages. It merely means that they now have to reorganize the advantages they already do have around making sure that they can control this new terrain. So I think what we see happening is that basically, I think that there were definitely, in the short run, there were absolutely a lot of losers out of this among this generation of senior men. I think this was also a time where you had some of the last generation of sheikhs who had not gone through a lot of formal schooling. So I also think that these sheikhs, they weren't necessarily as literate as the younger generation. Because there's a sort of the introduction of universal compulsory schooling in Jordan really doesn't take off until, I'm not a historian, but I mean, it's pretty obvious that, something pretty substantial happens if you look at, say, people who grew up in the 50s and 60s versus people who grew up in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. And now those people who grew up in the 70s and the 80s are increasingly able to assert themselves. And they're just, it's not just the technology either, I guess, right? It's also that they just have a much wider perspective because they're more literate. They've been exposed to more global media. I think they're more cosmopolitan, if not in outlook, than just sort of by virtue of exposure. Even if they're very threatened by it and they're very hostile to it, even they at least know it's out there and they sort of understand that there are other ways of living and what those are. And if they don't like it, they're probably very well informed about why they don't like it.
What do you think about the notion that Jordan is a federation of tribes? can we call Jordan a federation of tribes? And not only Jordan, we can say the same thing for Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Palestine, or Palestinian territories, because of the complicated situation in the West Bank and inability of Palestinian Arabs to form their institutions and to function normally under the Zionist occupation. I mean, they're still living in Bantustans, and it seems that we're not going to witness the two-state solution for a while. Can we call all these entities federations of tribes?
Yeah, I would say that it really varies from country to country, would be my argument. And that a lot of it has to do with really, I mean, I think it's you have to look at the actual structures in these different countries if you want to answer that. So I think that in the case of Jordan, what you get is, I think, probably one of the closest, I think Jordan and Saudi Arabia would be much closer to that model. In fact, and also in law, right? So de jure and de facto. Whereas I think the situation might be more de facto that way, but I think that the de jure distinctions are not insignificant, right? And there's an important point here, right? Which is that in Jordan, you have the existence of tribes. You obviously, of course, have wide swaths of civil society that don't like this, that want to change it, that see tribes as basically a sort of a problem, a sort of a barrier to modernization and development, that are working very hard actually to sort of diminish the power of these tribes, right? However, you also, of course, have people very close to the center of power who are very interested in legitimizing tribes and actually using tribes as an extension of state power, right? So in the Jordanian case, of course, there's a long history of the Hashemite monarchy, in particular, sort of styling itself as a, sort of a paramount sheikh, right? That the idea that basically the king is a sort of a sheikh mushayikh figure, right? That he
we're all members of the same family. We are members of the same tribe, and our sheikh is the ruler of the Hashemite dynasty. This is the concept.
Yeah.
So they tend to absorb all kinds of elements, indigenous population, which is minority in Jordan, and all kinds of groups, refugee groups, that came and settled to Jordan back in 1920s, 1940s, 70s, and in recent times. Yeah, that's a kind of a state policy, I would say.
Yeah, so that's the sort of the ideological side of it. The practical side of it is that the tribes become an extension of the police, right? So, for instance, it's very commonly said, even on Jordanian state television, that the tribes are the reason why Jordan is such a safe country, and that the reason why you have so little crime and sort of problems, as they call them in Jordan, is because people aren't afraid of the state, they're afraid of the tribes, right? And that basically it's the sort of the tribes that police people's behavior. And in fact, I've actually spoken to police officers who also very much hold this view, and they say that it's great if I have a problem, I'll just go talk to the sheikh, who's probably himself an ex-member of the security services himself, and he'll make sure that those troublemakers get a talking to. And so then, basically there's and in some cases, they'll even incorporate this into, sort of a larger discourse of counterinsurgency, these ideas of a sort of a ladder of security, and basically seeing these sort of sort of civil society or sort of non-state actors as extensions of state power, right? So I think that in the case of Jordan, we can see this idea of tribal federation working very well, right?
True, now, I think we don't have strong institutions. Our state institutions are on the opposite side of the spectrum from tribal values and tribal representatives. In my opinion, the general problem in the Middle East is that we don't have strong state institutions, although many of countries in the region are the oldest civilizations in the history, and they have very long tradition of statehood, but for one reason or another, they didn't develop strong civil institutions. And if we talk about secular society and civic society, we are far, far away from not only Europe, but maybe sub-Saharan Africa, according to some institutes that study the efficiency of civic institutions. Sub-Saharan Africa is way better than the Middle East, unfortunately for me, because I'm not part of the tribal network. And we discussed that at ACO a few years ago, 4 years ago, how I acted in a situation of a tribal conflict. My reaction wasn't in accordance with local customs, which could have backfired, but it's another topic. And what I wanted to ask you is, what kind of crisis is witnessed in Jordan's marriages? This is another topic that you covered, and we're going to return back to tribalism and social media, but I want to emphasize, I want to highlight another topic that you covered, so-called Chastity society, and how they address the social phenomenon of grooms and brides who are getting married in the later stage. For instance, in times of my grandfather and grandmother, and my grandmother is still alive, she's now over 90, she got married at the age of 15 or 16. Nowadays, it's more difficult for locals to marry at the age of 25 or even 30. I think you studied that with Chastity Society.
Yeah. So this idea of a crisis of marriage was basically the topic of my dissertation research, right? So everybody kept telling me that there was a crisis of marriage. And I was, fresh out of university, and I guess being, sort of a modern cosmopolitan subject, the idea that I would want to get married was not really on my radar. The idea that it would be a problem that people my age weren't getting married was something that seems very strange to me, right? So as I was saying in the beginning, right, I actually had to, first of all, get over a lot of my own assumptions just to even see what the problem was, right? But basically, a lot of things I think simultaneously, but a lot of it does come to center around this problem of rising rates of marriage, right? And so what you have to understand, first of all, is that people in Jordan, and I think that the Middle East more generally, they put a lot of emphasis on family relationships. Family is very important, I think, to people, as it is, of course, other places. But there's a couple of things that are rather distinctive about Jordan, right? So, and the Middle East more generally. So first of all, there's a really big concern around legitimacy in kinship, right? So this is the idea of knowing who your father is, right? Which again, right, was not necessarily something that I thought about as a big problem. Right now in America, of course, we have a whole genre of reality television dedicated to figuring out who the father is via the sort of TV talk show paternity test, right? But for people in Jordan, at least, this is not a satisfying way of establishing paternity, right? The idea that you could get a medical test that would prove, quote unquote, that someone was your father does not really cut it, right? The idea in Jordan, rather, is that there has to be this sort of, sort of relationship between the bride and the groom, the husband and the wife, that is ideally exclusive, and that where basically the sort of the wedding in particular, this sort of this is basically the publicization, if you will, of that marital relationship is key in creating a relationship of legitimacy that goes a number of directions simultaneously, right? So that's
you cannot have regular relationships with people if you're not married in Jordan, or you can, but if you hang out with members of the upper class, members of westernized upper class.
Yeah, so to be very blunt, yeah, the premarital sex in Jordan is, I think, absolutely less common than it is in other parts of the
Of
world.
course.
I've been challenged on this by people who simply don't believe me, who are Western, and they just can't imagine how a society could police other people's sexuality. But it is definitely possible to police young people's sexuality. I mean, it's not necessarily desirable, but it is a thing that can be done, I would argue. And it requires obviously a lot of surveillance, especially of women, keeping them in the home, being very sort of aware of their comings and goings, and having the whole family's social identity tied up with that, and
Of course.
with their ability to sort of
I mean, every
only,
year we have between 30 and 50 cases of women who get gunned down or stabbed to death because they were innocently talking to strangers, hanging around with strangers. Some of them were married and divorced, and still the family or the tribe keeps control on their whereabouts and they surveil them 24/7
yeah.
if they can.
Yeah, so
So,
this is a big piece of it, right? But then there's other stuff that's I think also important to note, right? Which is that your social identity is very much tied up with having children, especially in rural Jordan, right? So
true.
this is of course common throughout the Arab world. There's this thing called a kunya, or as we say in anthropological kinship studies, a technonym, right? So this is the phenomenon of being named after your first child, right? So when you have a child, if God willing, I were to have a child, I would stop being referred to as Jeff and I would become Abu Fulan, right? My child's
Yeah,
name would be
exactly.
Fulan and I would be Abu Fulan, right?
True.
My wife Blair would become Fulan or mother of Fulan, right? So my whole
True.
social identity would be tied up with these children who are the product of this legitimate marriage, right? And this also, of course, is when we see the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth happen in most Jordanian families, right? Which is on the one hand, you have the bride wealth or mahr, which is often thousands of dollars at a minimum. Usually, I think a good 6 months at least, I think, of the man's salary, right, is going into this, if not more. And then you also have the house. And even if the sort of the father is keeping control of the house, de jure, at least de facto, the family moving into the house and occupying it means that that's basically going to be theirs going forward. So in effect, they basically come to own the property and the house on top of the property through this marital ritual, right? So a huge amount of money and social prestige and social status all runs through this one event of marriage, right? And so it's incredibly important for people from a whole range of things, everything from having legitimate sexual relationships to getting a house to being able to be a full adult member of the community. All is basically being tied up with this event of marriage, right? And what we're seeing is something that we've seen throughout the world, right? Which is that with rising rates of education and industrialization, increasing life expectancy, that basically people begin to postpone marriage, right? And there's this phenomenon of what's called waithood, right? Which is this kind of liminal betwixt and between period between childhood and adulthood, where you're kind of, I mean, in terms of your body and maybe even your mentality, you're an adult, and yet you're not necessarily treated like an adult because you don't necessarily have adult status. You're probably still in school, or if you're not in school, you're probably under or unemployed, right? There's this phenomenon, as they often say, of being sayak farsha, right? You're sort of a mattress driver, basically sitting around waiting for some sort of economic opportunity to come up for you. Maybe you get a place in the army finally, or you get to go abroad and work in the Gulf or in the West somewhere.
Or you
And this
work
is,
in
of
the
course,
Jordan Times, like some of my colleagues.
yeah, right.
Of course.
But it's a rough time for people. I think it's very hard on people personally. I think it's especially difficult for young men. And then this also, I think what's especially difficult for young women is that if they don't get married in this period, and especially if they get to over the age of 25, then it becomes a lot more difficult for them to find a man who will marry them, because if the man had money to marry, he would just pick someone who is slightly younger, of whom there are many, right? So this, of course, then pushes them into marrying people who are divorced, or maybe people who, I mean, there's a good reason why they're not married, right? If they're then, you know, sort of looking for someone to marry who's over 25.
Yeah.
And so then this leads to the phenomenon of what's called spinsterhood or anusia, right? All of this, basically, I think there's a lot of very good reasons why people in Jordan are very concerned about the rising rates of marriage that are in a lot of ways endogenous to Jordanian customs and traditions and society that we don't see basically being such a problem elsewhere in the world. And then on top of this, you get a sort of we might call them moral entrepreneurs, right? There are people who they see, that people are suffering and that this obviously has a lot of social and economic ramifications. And then they see an opportunity to connect this up to their own issues, right? So I've looked at a number of different sort of groups that do this, right? You can look at obviously the Housing and Urban Development Corporation trying to solve the housing crisis is one way that you can sort of try and latch your issues onto this larger marriage crisis. And I've actually argued that they should probably play up even more how important their work is to the marriage crisis, because oftentimes I think wealthier people don't really understand just how much housing is a barrier to marriage I think for a lot of younger Jordanians. If you're living in a rural area, it's about buying the cement and steel rebar. If you're in an urban area, it's about the key money or it's about a mortgage or things like that. But in either case, this I think is for many working class, lower middle class people, the house is absolutely the biggest barrier to marriage, right? But there's, of course, also other sorts of actors who come into this. And I think the biggest one, of course, is the Islamic movement, right? Because the Islamic movement, of course, sees this as a way of connecting, at least I would argue, different kinds of legitimacy together that we might not necessarily think about in the same way. So, of course, I've already spoken at length about how the wedding creates bonds of legitimacy between kinship groups, between husband and wife, between father and child in particular, as well as between mother and child. But then, of course, there's this larger question of whether the state can be legitimate and that it can't oversee legitimate relationships between its citizens. And especially if we look at how, especially in the modern era, a state's legitimacy is tied to its ability to create the conditions for economic, social, and political flourishing of its citizens, then the question arises of if people can't get married, is the state really legitimate? And this is a way where if you come from a sort of a conservative political bent and you're traditionalist in outlook and also opposed to the state, that this idea of a marriage crisis can become an incredibly powerful way of couching a critique of the state in the everyday lived experiences of working and lower middle class people.
Do you think that the main problem for the modern generation of Jordanians and in general Arabs to get married according to customs and traditions of their forefathers are economic ones? Do you think that the economic situation in the region, economic situation in Jordan affects their ability to marry on time?
Yeah, so I think this is a deceptively difficult question to answer because on the one hand, it would seem very obvious that if you gave people more money, they would have an easier time getting married, right? But as I think many people have pointed out, there's a sort of a Bedouin proverb, everyone extends their legs according to the size of their mattress, right? The idea that, sort of if you gave people more money, so the sort of the discourse goes anyway, would it really make it easier for people to get married, or would it just sort of raise the bar on what's expected to get married, right? Mm-hmm. So for instance, a lot of elderly people, they'll sort of look at this marriage crisis and they'll say, this isn't really a problem, right? We lived al baraka, as they say. We lived with blessing, right? They didn't think about the future. We thought God would provide, Allah Kareem, God is generous.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they would basically say, the bride wealth might be, a verse of the Quran. It might not even be a sort of a monetary thing. The house would be, like a little tent. And beyond that, the wedding was bring your own goat, right? If you want to eat, you better bring some food, right? So everything would be very widely distributed. And you could see very humble weddings, potentially being organized, right? Mm. And then, of course, today we have the Chastity Society, which is an organization I've worked with. They organize mass weddings in which they not only basically provide a wedding for everybody for free, but the Jordanian Islamic Bank also provides every couple with a little bit of a sort of a little bit of money to start them out with.
Nice.
And yet, there's still tons of people who will complain about not being able to get married who would never even consider doing something like this, even if they were ideologically aligned with the Islamic movement.
Of course.
Right? It would be seen as
they're not going to give money to people like myself, but to those who are more acceptable for the taste of the society.
Yeah, but I mean, it also goes the other way, right? A lot of people would find this deeply humiliating. The idea that your wedding is a sort of a charitable endeavor, right? The idea is that,
yes.
sort of.
No, you're totally right.
So the idea would be that this is like you're coming out as an adult, right? This is you asserting yourself as a man, right? So the idea that your wedding then is a reflection of your social being, right, becomes, I think, incredibly powerful, right? So it's a complicated thing, right? Because dignity, I think it's easy on the one hand to try and separate dignity out from all of these supposedly material considerations, right? To say, oh, the dignity should be completely separate. You should be able to have dignity and be poor. It's a great idea, and I think it's easy. I think especially for intellectuals and what I talk about a little bit in the book is how the weddings themselves are oftentimes kind of set up to sort of highlight these sort of status and class differentials, right? So for instance, a lot of what makes these weddings so potent is that they involve these sort of unfakeable signs of status and power, right? And to not be able to do the sort of the traditional wedding properly, right, is to basically reveal yourself as not being a real man, right? So for instance, sort of the large heaping plates of meat has become incredibly central to what it means to have a proper tribal, sort of traditional Jordanian wedding, right? And of course, this is all completely mediated by the fact that lahm baladi, or sort of local meat, is incredibly expensive, right? So again, right, we come back to this idea of everybody extends their legs according to the size of their mattress, right?
Absolutely.
We could, of course, sort of you could import meat from sort of Australia or Romania or something.
Or Brazil.
Cost you.
I normally buy Brazilian beef.
Yeah, right.
I say this to my viewers. I recommend Brazilian beef.
Yeah, it would be
price
cheap,
wise and quality wise.
Yeah, the idea is
I would say that it's very easy to be honest and prideful if you're well off.
Yeah,
it's not so complicated, and it's not astrophysics to be honorable, respected, and loved by the society if you are well off. But the problem is with those people who have to maintain some kind of dignity, and they're not in a position to afford marriage, or to afford normal housing, or to afford a car or a proper job. For the end, I would love to talk about the book that you recently launched, and just tell us a few things about the book. We're going to talk about your work in the future. This is just the initial conversation between us. We've known each other for more than 4 years. We've collaborated, and we're going to collaborate on many fronts. So please tell us more about your book.
Yeah, so the book basically, it runs along two axes, right? On the one hand, the book is going through the process of getting married, right? So part one is about building the house. Part two is about the bride wealth and the process of the sort of the approach and the proposal and the acceptance and all of that. And then part three is about the wedding, right? So in that way, the structure of the book follows sort of the process of a young person in contemporary Jordan getting married, right? But then each part is a historical treatment of how that has changed over time. And also it's a comparison between more traditional ways of getting married and an urban institution that is trying to transform how people get married in that particular phase of the marriage process, right? So part one, I begin basically by actually giving an account of my own attempt to build a house, which I did in a little village somewhere in Madaba. And it's sort of all of my sort of adventures and hijinks of trying to, sort of get all the people together to build a house and all the problems we had doing that, and all the ways in which I had to rely on these extended kin networks to do that, and how house construction in rural Jordan oftentimes presupposes the involvement of an entire kin group. So I then compare that to the Housing and Urban Development Corporation, and especially a World Bank squatter settlement standardization program, which attempted to transform property relationships and introduce more private property relationships into Jordan, centered around this figure of the individual owner builder, who they saw as the best placed figure to basically fix Jordan's housing crisis, which of course is ongoing. It's never really been solved. And of course, in a lot of ways, we of course have to always remember, is itself a product of international geostrategic manipulations.
Absolutely.
Largely about basically the constant, sort of influx of refugees from elsewhere.
And the high birth rates. These two factors create the housing crisis. Plus, of course, mismanagement and unequal distribution of wealth. I don't think that Jordan is a poor country. Jordan has natural resources, and they have a budget of 11-12 billion Jordanian dinars a year, plus private money, which are higher than that. And I believe that the main issue is the mismanagement and unequal distribution of wealth in private and state sectors, and we can talk about that also in the future. If you want to add something else, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to finish up. So then part 2 of the book looks at basically the proposal, right? So it juxtaposes the traditional Jaha with the procedures of the contemporary Sharia courts, and looks at the emergence of contemporary Sharia court procedures over time. And then part 3 juxtaposes a traditional wedding with the mass weddings of the Chastity Society. So by reading the book, basically you get a sense both of what traditional marriage looked like, what Jordanians today are doing to preserve those customs and traditions, but also how some important political and social actors are actively working to transform how people get married.
Now I have another question for you. I wanted to finish, but it came to my mind. How do you see the relationship between tribal law and Sharia law? How much they are intertwined, or how much they stay on opposite side of the legal system?
Yeah, so I think in theory, you could imagine that they would be very much overlapping, right? Because there's definitely in Islam, there's a recognition of this idea of sort of tribal blood price. This idea of the sulha is very much, I think, part of Islamic jurisprudence, and it sort of obviously predates Islam. Islam comes into a very tribal society. But then this is, of course, I think where you get some tensions, right? Because in a lot of ways, I think it's pretty obvious that Islam is also a critique of some of the excesses of traditional tribal society, right? And so oftentimes, if you look at Sharia, there's a sort of an implicit, or oftentimes actually quite explicit, sociology of tribalism. And oftentimes when you look at Sharia jurisprudence, both historically and in contemporary times, there's some not too subtle hostility between Sharia practitioners and tribal law, right? So particularly, there's an idea that tribal law has these linkages with jahiliya and ignorance. And ignorance itself, and this idea of jahiliya, is often seen as very masculine, very much about sort of there's excess, it's excessive, it's violent
in machoism.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Sharia is against that.
Yeah, and so Sharia oftentimes constructs itself in opposition to that. Whether or not it actually succeeds is another matter. But you do then begin to see tensions emerging, right? So to give you just a couple of examples of how this can play out, I'm actually working on an article right now about a blood feud in the village of Suri that happened while I was in Jordan during Ramadan. And that was seen, of course, as a major sort of sort of flashpoint between tribal logics of law and justice and Sharia logics of law and justice, right? Which would say that you shouldn't fight during Ramadan. Obviously, you shouldn't fight at all from a Sharia perspective, but certainly not during
in theory,
Ramadan.
maybe you shouldn't fight, but in practice, we know that it's impossible.
Yeah, exactly, right. So that's, I think that's in the book. I also talk about specifically with the sort of the phenomenon of there's this thing now called divorce before consummation in Jordan, which has an interesting relationship to be married until the wedding. But in terms of contemporary Sharia jurisprudence, you're seen as being married after the marriage contract is signed. And increasingly, as part of this delayed marriage and the phenomenon of waithood, increasingly people get married and then they proceed to basically fight over the financial details of the actual wedding for a long period of time, which can lead to all of these divorces. Where, as far as the community is concerned, the people weren't married, but as far as the Sharia courts were concerned, they were married, right? And so then they basically created this new category out of their own knowledge practices of divorce before consummation to try and deal with this contradiction between tribal law, or at least customs and traditions, if not tribal law per se, and Sharia jurisprudence. So these are, I think, a couple of examples of how these different systems of law can come into conflict with each other.
Geoffrey, I'm very happy that you dedicated time for this conversation. Of course, we're going to continue discussing your book and your papers that you're preparing. Like I said many times, it's just the beginning. I knew that you were busy during the winter time, and we had to delay this talk for 6 months, but it was worth of waiting to hear from you. I hope you're going to visit Amman very soon and to join me in my drinking bouts. You're more than welcome, my friend.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
You too.